Sarah Martinez had always considered herself prepared for anything the mountains could throw at her. 28 years old, with a decade of hiking experience and a background in wilderness survival training, she approached the Cascade Range expedition with confidence that bordered on arrogance. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the next 5 days, perfect conditions for her solo trek through one of Washington state's most challenging wilderness areas. She packed methodically in her Seattle apartment, checking each item against her detailed list. Her backpack contained everything a seasoned hiker would need: a high-grade sleeping bag rated for temperatures down to -20 degrees, a lightweight but sturdy tent, enough freeze-dried meals for 7 days, water purification tablets, emergency flares, a first aid kit that could handle everything from blisters to broken bones, and a satellite communication device that she hoped she would never need to use. The drive to the trailhead took 4 hours through increasingly remote terrain. Cell phone towers became sparse, then disappeared entirely as she wound her way up the mountain roads. The last gas station was 30 miles behind her when she finally reached the parking area at Copper Creek Trail. Only 2 other vehicles sat in the gravel lot, both covered with a thin layer of frost that spoke to the elevation and dropping temperatures. Sarah shouldered her pack and began walking just after dawn. The trail started gently, winding through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp air, and she could hear the distant sound of Copper Creek rushing somewhere below the trail. The first few miles passed easily, her body settling into the familiar rhythm of long-distance hiking. By midday, she had climbed steadily into the alpine zone. The trees grew shorter and more sparse, giving way to vast meadows that would be filled with wildflowers in a few months but now lay dormant under patches of old snow. The silence was profound, broken only by her footsteps and the occasional call of a bird she could not identify. The weather began to change subtly around 2 in the afternoon. What had started as wispy white clouds began to thicken and darken. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Sarah pulled on an extra layer. She consulted her topographic map and GPS device, confirming that she was still on schedule to reach her planned camping spot near Crystal Lake before evening. But weather in the mountains follows no human schedule. By 4 o'clock, the first snowflakes began to fall, light and lazy at first, then with increasing intensity. Sarah checked her weather radio and heard a forecast that made her stomach tighten with concern. A late-season storm system had moved in faster than predicted, bringing heavy snow and dropping temperatures that could reach dangerous levels. She faced a critical decision. She could turn back and try to reach her car before conditions became truly dangerous, or she could push forward to Crystal Lake and wait out the storm in her planned campsite. The lake was only 3 miles ahead, but those miles would take her over an exposed ridge where the wind and snow would be at their worst. Sarah decided to continue. She had confidence in her equipment and her skills, and turning back would mean admitting defeat on what was supposed to be a routine expedition. She pulled her hood up and pressed forward into the growing storm. The next 2 hours tested every ounce of her experience and determination. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow as snow accumulated and visibility dropped to just a few yards. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally across the exposed slopes and making it impossible to keep her face uncovered for more than a few seconds at a time. When she finally reached Crystal Lake, the storm had become a full blizzard. The lake itself was partially frozen, dark water visible in patches between sheets of ice. Sarah quickly identified a sheltered spot among some large boulders and began setting up her tent, her fingers already numb despite her insulated gloves. The tent went up smoothly, testament to hours of practice in her backyard. She secured the guy lines with extra care, knowing that the wind would only get stronger throughout the night. Inside the tent, she changed into dry clothes and fired up her small camping stove to prepare a hot meal and warm drink. As darkness fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind seemed to be getting stronger, and she could hear it howling across the lake and through the rocks around her campsite. The temperature inside her tent dropped steadily despite her body heat and the warmth from her stove. Sarah tried to contact the outside world using her satellite communicator, but the storm was interfering with the signal. After several attempts, she managed to send a brief message to her emergency contact, her sister Maria in Seattle, letting her know that she was safe but weatherbound at Crystal Lake. She settled into her sleeping bag and tried to read by headlamp light, but the sound of the storm made concentration impossible. The wind seemed to be coming from all directions at once, and several times she felt the tent walls press inward as particularly strong gusts hit the exposed campsite. Around midnight, something changed. The constant roar of wind suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost more unsettling than the storm had been. Sarah unzipped the tent door slightly and peered outside. The snow was still falling, but gently now, without the driving force of the wind. Then, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices, faint but unmistakably human, coming from somewhere across the frozen lake. She listened intently, trying to make out words or determine how many people might be out there, but the sounds were too distant and muffled by the falling snow. Sarah zipped the tent door closed and lay still, listening. The voices seemed to be moving, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. She checked her watch, 12:30 in the morning. What were people doing out in this weather at this hour, and why hadn't she seen any sign of other hikers on the trail? A new sound reached her ears, the low rumble of an engine, mechanical and out of place in the wilderness setting. It seemed to be coming from the same direction as the voices, somewhere on the far side of the lake. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. A snowmobile rescue team? Park rangers checking on stranded hikers? But something about the secretive nature of the activity, the late hour, and the careful way the voices carried across the water suggested something else entirely. She reached for her camera and night vision binoculars, gifts from her brother who worked in security. Through the binoculars, she could make out shapes moving in the darkness on the opposite shore. Dark figures, at least 4 or 5 of them, moving with purpose around what looked like a large vehicle. No lights were visible except for occasional brief flashes that appeared to be covered flashlights or headlamps with red filters. The activity continued for nearly an hour. Sarah watched, fascinated and increasingly concerned, as the figures moved equipment from the vehicle to what appeared to be a concealed location among the trees. Their movements were coordinated and professional, like a military unit conducting a covert operation. Around 2 in the morning, the voices and mechanical sounds stopped abruptly. Through her binoculars, Sarah saw the vehicle moving away, its engine sound fading into the distance. The figures had disappeared as well, leaving no trace of their presence except for some disturbed snow that would likely be covered by morning. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag, mind racing. What had she witnessed? Drug dealers using the remote location for a drop? Government agents conducting some kind of classified operation? Smugglers moving contraband across the mountain passes? Whatever it was, the professional nature of the operation and the remote location suggested that these were not ordinary hikers or even ordinary criminals. She must have dozed off sometime before dawn because she woke to the sound of her tent zipper being slowly opened from the outside. Sunlight was streaming through the tent walls, indicating that the storm had passed and morning had arrived. But she knew she had not left the zipper partially open, and the sound was deliberate, careful, as if someone was trying not to wake her. Sarah held perfectly still, barely breathing, as the zipper continued its slow progress. Through barely opened eyes, she could see a gloved hand working the zipper tab. Beyond the hand, she caught a glimpse of winter camouflage clothing and what appeared to be tactical gear. Her heart hammered in her chest as she realized that whoever had been operating across the lake the night before had found her campsite. They knew she was there, and they were now investigating what she might have seen. Sarah's training kicked in, and she began to calculate her options for escape or self-defense, but she was trapped in her sleeping bag inside a tent with only one exit, facing an unknown number of potentially dangerous individuals. The zipper stopped moving when it reached about the halfway point. Sarah could hear breathing from just outside the tent, and she sensed that someone was looking inside, studying her sleeping form. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, the zipper began to move again, this time closing the tent door. Sarah waited, listening to the sound of footsteps moving around her campsite. She could hear at least 2 different voices speaking in low tones, too quiet for her to make out words. The footsteps seemed to be circling the tent, and she had the distinct impression that her campsite was being thoroughly examined. After several minutes, the voices and footsteps moved away, but Sarah remained motionless for another hour, afraid that any movement might bring them back. When she finally worked up the courage to look outside, she found her campsite exactly as she had left it the night before, with no sign that anyone had been there. But, as she packed up her gear, she noticed small details that confirmed her fears. Footprints in the snow around her tent, too large to be her own. A small piece of equipment that had been moved slightly from where she had left it. Most disturbing of all, her satellite communicator was missing from the outside pocket of her pack where she always kept it for easy access. Sarah realized that she was now truly alone in the mountains, cut off from any means of communication with the outside world, and that someone knew exactly where she was and what she might have witnessed. The beautiful wilderness that had seemed like a peaceful retreat just 24 hours earlier had become a trap, and she was being watched by people who clearly had reason to want their activities to remain secret. As she shouldered her pack and began hiking toward what she hoped would be safety, Sarah had no way of knowing that her ordeal was just beginning, and that the covert operation she had stumbled upon was far more significant and dangerous than anything she could have imagined. Sarah's hands trembled as she folded her tent, not from the cold but from the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Every few seconds, she glanced around the treeline, expecting to see figures in camouflage watching her from the shadows. The missing satellite communicator felt like a death sentence in this remote location, cutting off her only reliable link to civilization. She decided to abandon her original hiking plan and head directly back toward the trailhead. The quickest route would take her around the eastern shore of Crystal Lake, but that meant passing close to where she had observed the mysterious activity. After weighing her options, she chose a longer path that would keep her on the opposite side of the lake, adding several miles to her journey but potentially keeping her away from whoever was operating in the area. The morning was crisp and clear, with fresh snow covering everything in a pristine blanket that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Sarah moved as quietly as possible, pausing frequently to listen for any sounds that might indicate she was being followed. The silence was unnerving after years of hiking in areas where she might encounter other outdoor enthusiasts or hear the distant sound of traffic. About an hour into her hike, she discovered that her fears were justified. Fresh snowshoe tracks appeared on the trail ahead of her, leading in the same direction she was traveling. The tracks were recent, made since the snow had stopped falling, and they showed a purposeful, steady pace that suggested someone with experience in winter travel. Sarah studied the tracks carefully. 2 different sets, indicating at least 2 people. The snowshoes were military style, designed for carrying heavy loads over long distances. Most telling of all, the tracks showed no signs of the wandering or exploration typical of recreational hikers. These people knew exactly where they were going. She faced another difficult decision. Continue on the main trail and risk encountering whoever was ahead of her, or bushwhack through the unmarked forest where she could easily become lost but might avoid contact with the mysterious figures. The temperature was already dropping again, and weather reports she had heard before losing her communicator suggested another storm system approaching. Sarah chose to leave the trail. She pulled out her compass and topographic map, plotting a course that would take her roughly parallel to the main trail but several hundred yards into the forest. The going would be much more difficult, especially with fresh snow hiding obstacles like fallen logs and creek beds, but it offered her best chance of avoiding detection. The forest travel was exhausting. Every step required careful consideration as she navigated around dense thickets, climbed over snow-covered deadfall, and crossed small streams that were partially frozen and treacherous. Her pace slowed to less than half of what she could maintain on the trail, and she began to worry about whether she could reach safety before the next storm arrived. Around midday, she stopped to rest and eat in a small clearing where she could observe her surroundings. As she nibbled on energy bars and tried to warm her hands, she heard the distant sound of voices again. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the main trail, roughly where she estimated she would have been if she had continued on the established path. Sarah crept to the edge of the clearing and listened intently. The voices were too far away to make out individual words, but she could detect a tone of urgency or concern. A few minutes later, she heard what sounded like radio communications, brief bursts of static followed by tinny voices. Whoever these people were, they had equipment more sophisticated than typical hiking gear. She decided to try to get closer to observe what was happening, driven by a combination of curiosity and the practical need to understand what she was dealing with. Moving carefully through the trees, she worked her way toward the source of the sounds. From a concealed position behind a large fallen cedar, Sarah was able to observe a section of the main trail about 50 yards away. 3 figures in winter camouflage were examining the ground intently, clearly tracking something or someone. 2 of them carried what appeared to be military-style rifles, while the third held a device that looked like a handheld GPS unit or radio. One of the figures pointed in her direction, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped until she realized they were pointing at her original tracks, the one she had made when leaving the trail hours earlier. They had found the point where she had abandoned the established path and were now trying to determine which direction she had gone. The tracker with the GPS device spoke into a radio, and Sarah caught fragments of his transmission carried on the cold air, left the trail, heading west into the timber, approximately 3 hours ago. The response was too faint to hear, but the tracker nodded and gestured for his companions to follow him into the forest. Sarah realized with growing horror that they were hunting her specifically. This was not a chance encounter or a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. These people had identified her as a threat and were now actively pursuing her through the wilderness. She began moving immediately, abandoning any attempt at stealth in favor of speed. Behind her, she could hear the pursuers crashing through the underbrush, no longer concerned with remaining quiet now that they had picked up her trail. They were following her tracks in the snow, and, despite her head start, they were gaining ground. The forest became her enemy. Every branch seemed designed to catch her pack or clothing, every hidden log threatened to trip her, and every slope tried to send her sliding into obstacles she could not see until the last second. The fresh snow made footing treacherous, and she fell several times, once sliding 15 feet down a steep slope before catching herself against a tree. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. She could hear individual voices now, calling out positions to each other like a coordinated search team. They were spreading out, trying to flank her or cut off her escape routes. Sarah realized that these were not ordinary criminals or even typical military personnel. They moved in, communicated like special operations forces conducting a manhunt. Desperation drove her to take increasingly dangerous risks. She traversed slopes that should have required ropes, jumped across creek beds that could have resulted in serious injury if she had missed, and pushed through areas of deadfall that could have trapped her if she had become stuck. Adrenaline masked her exhaustion, but she knew that she could not maintain this pace much longer. As afternoon gave way to evening, Sarah found herself in a canyon she did not recognize from her maps. The steep walls offered some concealment, but they also limited her escape routes. Worse, the temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and she could see new clouds building on the horizon. She paused to catch her breath and check her position, but when she tried to consult her GPS device, she discovered that it had been damaged during one of her falls. The screen was cracked and dark, leaving her with only her compass and paper maps to navigate in increasingly difficult conditions. The sound of voices echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to determine exactly where her pursuers were or how many of them there might be. The acoustic properties of the narrow space turned every sound into a confusing jumble that seemed to come from all directions at once. Sarah climbed upward along the canyon wall, looking for a way out of the trap she had inadvertently entered. Her hands were numb despite her gloves, and she could feel the beginning stages of hypothermia setting in as her core body temperature began to drop. She needed shelter, warmth, and food, but stopping long enough to properly care for herself would allow her pursuers to close the distance. Near the top of the canyon wall, she found a small cave formed by an overhang of rock. It was barely large enough for one person, but it offered concealment and some protection from the wind that was beginning to pick up again. Sarah crawled inside and tried to assess her situation. She was lost in unmarked wilderness with damaged navigation equipment. She was being actively hunted by what appeared to be professional soldiers or operatives. The temperature was dropping toward dangerous levels, and another storm was approaching. She had enough food for several more days, but her water was running low, and she had no way to purify more without risking exposure by building a fire. Most critically, no one knew where she was. Her planned route would have taken her in a completely different direction, and she had deviated so far from the established trails that even an organized search and rescue operation would be unlikely to find her quickly. From her hiding place, Sarah could see lights moving in the canyon below. Flashlights or headlamps, at least 3 of them, sweeping back and forth in a systematic search pattern. The lights moved with military precision, overlapping their coverage areas and advancing methodically up the canyon floor. She pressed herself deeper into the cave and tried to control her breathing, which was creating visible vapor clouds in the cold air. Any sign of her presence would bring the searchers directly to her location, and she had nowhere left to run. One of the lights stopped moving and pointed directly at the cliff face below her position. Sarah held her breath as the beam swept up the rock wall, passed over her hiding place, and continued upward. The searcher held the position for several long seconds before moving on, but Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he had detected something even if he could not identify exactly what it was. The search continued for another hour, with the lights moving back and forth across the canyon floor and occasionally probing the walls and overhangs where someone might try to hide. Sarah remained motionless, fighting off the shivering that threatened to give away her position and struggling to stay alert as exhaustion and cold began to overwhelm her. Finally, the lights moved away toward the mouth of the canyon, and Sarah heard the sound of voices retreating into the distance. But she knew this was not the end of her ordeal. They would return with more people and better equipment, and they would expand their search area until they found her. As the first snowflakes of the new storm began to fall, Sarah realized that she had perhaps one night to figure out how to escape from what had become a deadly game of cat and mouse in one of the most remote and unforgiving environments on Earth. The people hunting her were professionals with unlimited resources and government-level equipment, while she was alone with basic camping gear and no way to call for help. The irony was not lost on her that the very isolation she had sought for peace and solitude had now become the instrument of her potential doom. Whatever she had witnessed at Crystal Lake was important enough that someone was willing to commit considerable resources to ensuring her silence, and she was beginning to understand that her life depended on either escaping their net or finding a way to convince them that she posed no threat to their operation. But, as the snow began to fall harder and the temperature continued to drop, escape seemed increasingly impossible, and she had no idea how to communicate with people who shot first and asked questions later. The mountain that had called to her spirit for adventure was now her prison, and the cold that she had always respected as a manageable challenge was becoming her executioner. The storm that had threatened all day arrived with devastating intensity just after midnight. Sarah huddled in her inadequate cave as hurricane-force winds drove snow horizontally across the canyon, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to mere inches. The temperature plummeted to levels that made survival without proper shelter nearly impossible. Despite the misery of her situation, Sarah recognized that the storm might provide her with the opportunity she desperately needed. Her pursuers, no matter how well equipped, would have to take shelter and wait for conditions to improve before continuing their hunt. If she could endure the cold and navigate in zero visibility, she might be able to escape while they were forced to remain stationary. But moving in these conditions was like stepping into another world entirely. The familiar landscape had been transformed into an alien environment where every reference point was erased by the driving snow. Sarah could not see her own feet, let alone identify landmarks or follow any kind of route. The wind was so strong that it knocked her off balance repeatedly, and the snow stung her exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. She decided to follow the canyon downstream, reasoning that it would eventually lead to lower elevations and, potentially, to the main creek drainage system. By keeping one hand on the canyon wall and moving slowly, she could maintain her sense of direction even when she could see nothing else. The journey became a nightmare of endurance. Every step was a struggle against the wind and the accumulating snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the hour. Her feet went numb within the first 30 minutes, and she began to lose feeling in her fingers despite wearing her warmest gloves. The cold seemed to penetrate every layer of clothing, reaching her core and beginning the process of shutting down her body's non-essential functions. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Sarah stumbled and fell face-first into a snowdrift that was deeper than she was tall. For a moment, she panicked as the snow closed over her head and she struggled to determine which direction was up. When she finally fought her way to the surface, she realized that she had lost contact with the canyon wall and could no longer determine which direction she had been traveling. The disorientation was complete and terrifying. In every direction, she saw only swirling white snow driven by screaming wind. Her tracks had been erased within seconds of making them, and she had no way to determine whether she was moving toward safety or deeper into the wilderness. Sarah forced herself to remain calm and think logically about her situation. She remembered a survival technique from her training. In whiteout conditions, the best strategy was often to seek immediate shelter and wait for visibility to improve rather than risk becoming completely lost. But the storm showed no signs of abating, and her body temperature was dropping to dangerous levels. She needed to find better protection soon, or hypothermia would make the decision for her. Using her hands to feel through the snow, Sarah discovered what felt like a large boulder or rock outcropping. As she explored further, she realized that it was actually the entrance to a much larger cave system than the small overhang where she had been hiding. The opening was partially concealed by snow and vegetation, which explained why she had not noticed it during daylight hours. Inside the cave, the relief from the wind was immediate and profound. Sarah could hear the storm raging outside, but the interior was relatively warm and completely dry. Using her headlamp, she explored the space and discovered that it extended back into the mountain much further than she had expected. The cave appeared to be natural, formed by water erosion over thousands of years, but as Sarah ventured deeper, she began to find signs of human presence. Empty food containers, battery casings, and other debris suggested that someone had used this place as a shelter or supply depot relatively recently. In a chamber about 50 feet from the entrance, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Stacked against one wall were military-style supply crates, each marked with stenciled numbers and letters that meant nothing to her but suggested official government equipment. The crates were locked, but some had been opened and contained items that made her blood run cold. Communications equipment far more sophisticated than anything civilian hikers would carry. Night vision devices. Weapons that she did not recognize but that looked both expensive and dangerous. Maps of the region marked with positions and routes that were clearly part of some kind of operational plan. Most disturbing of all, photographs of people who appeared to be under surveillance, including pictures of her own car in the trailhead parking area taken with telephoto lenses. Sarah realized that she had stumbled into something far larger than a simple smuggling operation or even a drug trafficking network. The equipment and documentation suggested a long-term covert operation being conducted by people with significant resources and government connections. Her presence in the area had been noted and assessed as a threat to whatever they were doing. As she examined the materials more closely, she began to piece together fragments of information that suggested a massive illegal surveillance operation targeting civilian populations in the region. References to assets in place and observation posts indicated a network of hidden installations throughout the wilderness areas where people believed they had privacy and freedom from government monitoring. One document that had been left partially open contained detailed biographical information about dozens of individuals, including their personal relationships, financial situations, political affiliations, and potential vulnerabilities. Sarah recognized some of the names as prominent citizens of nearby communities, people who had never given any indication of being involved in criminal activities or posing threats to national security. The implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, they suggested that a rogue intelligence operation was conducting illegal domestic surveillance on American citizens, using the remote wilderness areas as cover for their activities. The scale and sophistication of the operation would require enormous funding and support from within the government itself. Sarah photographed as many documents as she could with her camera, though she was not sure how she would ever be able to share the information if she did not survive her current predicament. The evidence was explosive, but it was also incredibly dangerous to possess. No wonder her pursuers were willing to use lethal force to protect their operation. As she worked through the materials, she heard a sound that made her freeze in terror. The unmistakable noise of snow machines approaching the cave entrance, their engines barely audible over the storm but growing steadily louder. Someone was coming, and they knew exactly where to find her. Sarah quickly gathered the most important documents she had photographed and retreated deeper into the cave system, hoping to find another exit or at least a place where she could hide until her pursuers moved on. But, as she explored the deeper chambers, she realized that the cave was more complex than she had initially thought. Artificial lighting had been installed in some of the deeper passages, powered by generators that must be located somewhere else in the system. The walls showed signs of recent excavation and improvement, suggesting that this location had been developed as more than just a supply depot. It was a permanent installation designed to support long-term operations. In one of the deepest chambers, Sarah discovered what appeared to be a command center. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls, displaying maps, satellite images, and data feeds from sources she could not identify. Multiple computer workstations suggested that several people worked in this location on a regular basis, processing intelligence and coordinating surveillance activities across a wide area. The scope of the operation was breathtaking and terrifying. Sarah realized that she had uncovered what was possibly the largest domestic intelligence gathering operation in American history, conducted entirely outside the oversight of Congress or the courts. The people running this program had unlimited resources and no accountability, which explained their willingness to eliminate anyone who stumbled across their activities. Behind her, she could hear voices and footsteps as her pursuers entered the cave system. They moved with confidence and familiarity, clearly knowing the layout and having access to the hidden passages that Sarah was discovering for the first time. Multiple teams seemed to be spreading through the complex, sealing off potential escape routes and conducting a systematic search. Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. She was trapped in an underground facility with people who intended to kill her to protect secrets that could topple governments if they ever became public. She had evidence of crimes that reached to the highest levels of power, but no way to share that evidence with anyone who could act on it. The sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, and Sarah realized that she had only minutes before they found her hiding place in the command center. She made a desperate decision to try to use their own equipment against them, accessing one of the computer terminals to see if she could send her photographs and information to news organizations or law enforcement agencies outside the corrupted system. But, as her fingers touched the keyboard, light suddenly illuminated the chamber, and she heard the sound of weapons being readied behind her. A calm voice spoke from the entrance to the chamber. "Please step away from the equipment and turn around slowly. Keep your hands visible at all times." Sarah turned to face three figures in full tactical gear, their faces hidden behind night vision equipment and their weapons trained on her chest. The speaker was a woman, perhaps in her 40s, with the bearing and confidence of someone accustomed to command. Behind her stood two men who looked like professional soldiers, alert and dangerous but taking their cues from their leader. "My name is Colonel Rebecca Hayes," the woman said, removing her night vision goggles to reveal intelligent green eyes and a face that would have been unremarkable in any other context. "I think you and I need to have a conversation about what you've seen and what you think you understand about our operation here." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to determine whether this was an opportunity to negotiate for her life or simply a more civilized form of execution. Colonel Hayes spoke with the authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed, but there was something in her manner that suggested she was not simply another government assassin eliminating inconvenient witnesses. "Before you make any assumptions about our intentions," Hayes continued, "I want you to know that everything you've discovered here tonight represents a critical national security operation that has been saving American lives for the past 3 years. You have stumbled into something that you cannot possibly understand, but that does not automatically make you an enemy." The colonel gestured for her men to lower their weapons slightly, though they remained ready to respond instantly to any threatening movement. Sarah realized that this might be her only chance to learn what was really happening and, possibly to find a way out of her desperate situation alive. "I think it's time for you to learn the truth about what we're really doing here," Hayes said, settling into one of the operator chairs and indicating that Sarah should sit across from her. "Because the choice you make in the next few hours will determine not just whether you live or die, but whether a lot of other innocent people continue to be protected from threats you can't imagine." Sarah sat across from Colonel Hayes in the underground command center, her mind struggling to process the surreal situation. Hours earlier, she had been a terrified victim fleeing through a blizzard. Now she found herself in what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence facility, being offered explanations by someone who claimed to be protecting national security. 3 years ago, Hayes began, her voice steady and professional, "We uncovered evidence of a domestic terrorist network planning coordinated attacks against critical infrastructure across the Pacific Northwest. Not the kind of amateur extremists you read about in the newspapers, but a well-funded, highly organized group with connections to foreign intelligence services and access to military-grade weapons and explosives." The colonel activated one of the computer screens, displaying satellite images and surveillance footage that showed remote facilities hidden throughout the region. They were using the wilderness areas as training camps and supply depots, taking advantage of the fact that millions of acres of public land receive virtually no federal oversight or regular monitoring. Sarah studied the images, seeing evidence of structures and activities that would be invisible to casual hikers but clearly represented significant operations when viewed from above. The normal law enforcement and intelligence agencies were completely inadequate to deal with this threat, Hayes continued. Local sheriff's departments lack the resources and training. The FBI and other federal agencies are constrained by jurisdictional limitations and legal restrictions that make covert surveillance nearly impossible. So you created your own organization, Sarah said, beginning to understand the scope of what she had discovered. Hayes nodded. A joint task force drawing personnel and resources from multiple agencies, operating under special authorities granted by the highest levels of government. Our mission is to identify, monitor, and neutralize threats before they can carry out attacks against civilian targets. The colonel brought up another screen showing a timeline of prevented incidents. In the past 3 years, we have prevented 17 separate terrorist attacks, including planned bombings of hydroelectric dams, coordinated assaults on shopping centers, and attempts to poison water supplies serving over 2 million people. None of these successes have been made public because revealing our methods would compromise our ability to continue protecting people. Sarah felt her certainty beginning to waver. The evidence Hayes was showing her suggested a legitimate counter-terrorism operation rather than the rogue surveillance program she had initially suspected. But questions remained about the scope of their activities and the people they were monitoring. What about the files on civilians, she asked. The biographical information and surveillance reports on people who aren't involved in terrorism? Hayes pulled up one of the files Sarah had seen earlier, showing detailed information about a local business owner. John Patterson, owner of Patterson Hardware in Cascade Falls. Divorced father of 2, active in local politics, member of the city council. On the surface, exactly the kind of upstanding citizen you would never suspect of criminal activity. The screen changed to show surveillance photographs of Patterson meeting with individuals in remote locations, exchanging packages and conducting what appeared to be clandestine communications. Patterson has been providing the terrorist network with detailed information about local infrastructure, including water treatment facilities, electrical substations, and emergency response protocols. He's also been helping them identify potential recruits from among disaffected veterans and unemployed loggers in the region. Sarah studied the evidence, seeing a pattern of activities that clearly indicated criminal conspiracy. We monitor people like Patterson not because we want to violate their privacy, but because identifying and tracking domestic terrorists requires understanding their entire network of supporters and sympathizers, Hayes explained. But how do you decide who to investigate? Sarah asked. How do you prevent this kind of operation from becoming a general surveillance program targeting anyone the government considers undesirable? Hayes leaned back in her chair, and, for the first time, Sarah saw something that might have been uncertainty in her expression. That's the question that keeps me awake at night, the colonel admitted. We operate under strict guidelines and oversight mechanisms, but you're right to be concerned about the potential for abuse. The reality is that preventing terrorist attacks requires gathering intelligence on people who have not yet committed crimes but who might be planning to do so. It's an inherently difficult balance between protecting public safety and preserving civil liberties. We try to err on the side of caution, but mistakes are inevitable. Sarah considered what she had been told, trying to reconcile her initial assumptions with the new information Hayes was providing. Why are you telling me this instead of just eliminating me as a threat to your operation? Because I've been reviewing your background since we identified you in the area, Hayes replied, bringing up a file that contained detailed information about Sarah's life, education, work history, and personal relationships. You're not a terrorist sympathizer or foreign agent. You're an experienced hiker who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. More importantly, you're someone with a background in emergency management and disaster response. You understand the importance of protecting critical infrastructure and the difficulty of preventing attacks by people who are willing to die for their cause. I'm hoping that understanding will make you willing to help us rather than expose us. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the extent of the investigation that had been conducted into her personal life. Help you how? By continuing your hiking trip as planned and never speaking about what you've seen here, Hayes said simply. By understanding that revealing our operation would not expose government wrongdoing, but would instead cripple our ability to prevent future terrorist attacks and protect innocent lives. And if I refuse? Hayes was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then, you would be making a decision that could result in the deaths of hundreds or thousands of people when we lose the ability to monitor and prevent attacks. I would have to consider whether protecting our operation justified taking actions that I would prefer never to contemplate. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Sarah realized that regardless of the legitimacy of their mission, these people had demonstrated that they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. Her survival depended on convincing them that she would keep their operation confidential. I need proof, Sarah said finally. If you want me to believe that you're the good guys, I need to see evidence that the threats you're preventing are real and imminent. Hayes considered the request, then began accessing files that showed intercepted communications, weapons caches, and operational plans seized from terrorist suspects. The evidence was extensive and convincing, detailing plots that would have resulted in massive casualties if they had been carried out successfully. Last month, Hayes said, showing surveillance footage of a group of men conducting training exercises with explosives, we prevented an attack on the Cascade Falls Dam that would have killed an estimated 3,000 people downstream and left 500,000 without electricity or clean water for months. 2 weeks ago, we intercepted a planned assault on the Westfield shopping center during the Christmas shopping season. The attackers had acquired automatic weapons and enough ammunition to sustain a firefight with law enforcement for hours. Conservative estimates suggested casualties in the hundreds. Sarah studied the evidence, seeing detailed planning and sophisticated preparation that clearly indicated serious criminal intent. The scope and scale of the threats were far beyond anything she had imagined when she first witnessed the covert activity at Crystal Lake. These people are not disorganized extremists acting on impulse, Hayes continued. They have training, funding, and operational support from sources we are still trying to identify completely. Stopping them requires intelligence gathering and surveillance capabilities that exceed what traditional law enforcement agencies can provide within existing legal frameworks. So you operate outside the law, Sarah said. We operate under special authorities that allow us to take actions that would be illegal for normal law enforcement agencies, Hayes corrected. Everything we do is authorized at the highest levels of government and subject to oversight by officials who understand both the threats we face and the methods necessary to counter them. Sarah realized that she was facing an impossible decision. If Hayes was telling the truth, the operation represented a necessary response to genuine terrorist threats that could not be addressed through normal channels. If she was lying or if the operation had exceeded its legitimate authority, then exposing it would serve the public interest despite the personal risk. I want to speak with the oversight officials, Sarah said. If this operation is legitimate, then there should be people in Washington who can confirm its authorization and explain the safeguards that prevent abuse. Hayes smiled for the first time since their conversation began. I was hoping you would ask for that kind of verification rather than simply accepting or rejecting what I've told you. It shows the kind of critical thinking that makes me confident you'll make the right decision. The colonel activated a secure communication system and placed a call to a number that connected directly to a high-ranking official in the Department of Homeland Security. Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah found herself in a conference call with people whose names she recognized from news reports, discussing counter-terrorism operations and national security threats at a level of detail that convinced her of the program's legitimacy. When the call ended, Hayes turned back to Sarah with an expression that combined respect and expectation. Now you understand what we're really doing here and why it's necessary. The question is whether you're willing to help us continue protecting people by keeping our methods confidential. Sarah considered everything she had learned, weighing her concerns about government overreach against the evidence of genuine threats that required extraordinary responses. I'll keep your secrets, she said finally, but I want assurances that there are real safeguards in place to prevent abuse and that the operation will be subject to regular review by people outside your organization. You have those assurances, Hayes replied, and you have my personal commitment that if you ever have concerns about our activities, you can contact me directly to discuss them. The colonel provided Sarah with encrypted contact information and detailed instructions for reporting any suspicious activity she might observe in the future. You've accidentally become part of a network of citizens who help us protect the country by providing information and maintaining operational security. It's not a role you asked for, but it's one that serves the greater good. As dawn broke over the mountains, the storm finally began to clear, and Hayes arranged for Sarah to be transported back to the main trail system by snowmobile. The ride through the forest gave her time to reflect on the extraordinary events of the past 24 hours and the decision she had made to become part of something much larger than a simple hiking trip. When Sarah reached her car at the trailhead, she found it exactly as she had left it, with no sign of the surveillance she now knew had been conducted while she was in the wilderness. The transformation from hunted fugitive to trusted ally had happened so quickly that she struggled to accept the reality of her new situation. Driving home to Seattle, Sarah realized that her relationship with the mountains had changed forever. What had once been a place of personal refuge and natural beauty had revealed itself to be the backdrop for a hidden war between those who would harm innocent people and those charged with protecting them. She would return to the wilderness many times in the years that followed, but she would never again be just an ordinary hiker seeking solitude and adventure. She had become part of a secret network of ordinary citizens helping to guard against extraordinary threats, carrying knowledge that could never be shared but that made her sleep easier knowing that someone was watching over the places and people she loved. The mountain cold that had nearly killed her had instead led to her rebirth as someone with a deeper understanding of the hidden complexities of the world and a personal commitment to protecting the freedoms that most people took for granted. Sometimes the greatest adventures were not the ones you planned, but the ones that found you when you least expected them and changed your life forever.